Hello, 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 I am Kaczmar and welcome to Geek Factor. Today I'll be teaching you how to play Galaxy of Traian. Galaxy of Traian is an epic 4X game. Now, the Kickstarter campaign for this game will launch on, or has already launched, depending on when you're watching this video. But the launch for the Kickstarter campaign is May 2nd. And now you can find the link to the campaign in the description below. Listen, in this game you will be in charge of one of the races included in the box. Now, your race will try your best to explore, dominate and exploit various parts of the galaxy. Will you be better than your opponents? Well, only the gameplay will tell. Listen, this is a 2 to 4 player game at its basis, but with various add-ons you can expand it to even up to 8 players, which is pretty big. It's a lot of players, trust me. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm gonna set up for a 2-player game to show you how various mechanisms work. So now let's move on to the setup of the game. So the first thing that happens is each player picks a race and then takes the corresponding race board. Then each player collects their plastic figures. Now the number of figures is dependent on the number of players. We're setting up a 2-player game, so we're taking 9 emissaries, 9 research stations, 4 space stations, and the number of ships, the Corvette class ships and the Rogue class ships is always the same no matter what number of players. But these 3, the emissaries, research stations and the space stations, varies dependent on the number of players. You then place those figures on the corresponding areas on your player board. You can determine which figures go onto which spaces based on the size of the space when it comes to the stations and the emissaries, or on the drawings on the spaces when it comes to the ships. Now you take the 3 big skills tokens. Now those tokens are two-sided because each race has a specific set of 3 skills, but on the other side of those tokens you can find universal skills. I'll tell you more about them in a second. As you can see, those symbols indicate that each race has a set of 2 starting skills that are active from the beginning. If your race comes with a certain dedicated tokens, you take them as well. Not all races have those, so be sure to check that. Now each player takes 10 credits from the bank, places them nearby, and this is your starting budget. Then you draw 1 combat token randomly from the bag. You check what it is, but you keep it secret from the rest of the players. So you put it face down in your gaming area. So this is basically what your player area will look like during the game. Now if there are any player components that will not be used during the game, you put them back in the box. I'm talking for example about obviously the figures and the components for races that are not taking part in this game, but also for example for figures that you're not going to be using because for example the number of players dictates that you're not going to be using 9 stations or 9 emissaries, for example. So that was the player area. Now let's turn to the common area. The first thing you do is you take all the space tiles and you make sure that none of them are showing the Exmitter, the trade outpost or the teleport face up. You make sure that all those space tiles are face down. Once you've done that, you shuffle them all together and then you place them in 2 equal stacks on this rack. You then place this rack within equal reach of all players. You then place all of the minerals in the designated bag and then you place the bag on the side of the gaming area. Now you do the exact same thing with the combat tokens, where you also place them in the bag. Then you take all the credits and you sort them by their value and you keep them nearby, making this sort of a bank. Now please be sure to know that this plastic container does not come with the game. This is my personal plastic container that I'm using just to keep the area tidy. And that's the setup. So now let's begin with the gameplay. The gameplay will go through a series of player turns. Now on their turn, a player will go through 3 phases. Once they completed all 3 phases, or at least one, I'll go back to that in a second. Now then it's the next player's turn, and the next, and the next, and the next, and so on until the end game's conditions are met. Now the end game's condition is running out of those space tiles. So on their turn, a player goes through 3 phases. extraction, expansion and exploration. Now phases 1 and 3, extraction and exploration, are optional. A player can choose not to resolve those phases, so he either cannot resolve those phases or doesn't want to resolve those phases. But every player during their turn has to resolve phase 2, which is expansion. But before we move on to the second phase, first let's see what can happen or will happen depending on your choice during the first phase, extraction. During that phase, you can take as many actions as you want and you can choose from 3 actions. Now you have those 3 actions and you can take them in any order you like and take one action as many times as you can or want. Let's see what those actions are and how they play out. Now the first thing you can do in phase 1 is trade, which means buying and exchanging minerals and buying combat tokens. If you want to buy a mineral, you pay 6 credits to the bank, and then you take the bag and you just draw the chosen mineral. You get to choose which mineral you want to buy. So for example, I want to buy a blue mineral. I take the blue mineral, I put the rest in the bag. With combat tokens, the situation is similar, but you pay 4 credits to the bank, and then you don't choose which combat token you get to buy. You draw randomly one from the bag. Remember to keep it secret from the other players and keep it face down on your player area. Now later during the game, if you manage to get one of your emissaries on a trade outpost anywhere on the board, anywhere on the galaxy, the price goes down, which means you can buy the mineral for 5 credits and the combat token for 3 credits. The only condition here is that this emissary has to be unblocked. Now the emissary is blocked if on the same tile, but obviously on the outer space area, there is a corvette class ship belonging to the opponent. You can use the trade action not only to buy things, but also to exchange things, in this case, minerals. Specifically, I mean, you can take 2 minerals of any type and exchange them into 1 mineral of a given type, a specific type that you want. For example, here I have a green and a red mineral, and I need a blue mineral for some reason. I can put those back in the bag and then simply draw a blue mineral from the bag. Now the second thing you can do is gain minerals. In order to gain minerals, you have to have a closed nebula. This is what a closed nebula looks like. I will tell you about closing nebulas and space areas and planet systems in a few moments, but for now, this is what it looks like. And in order to gain minerals from this closed nebula, you have to have at least a research station on this nebula, and you have to control this nebula. Now the way it works is, if you have a research station on the closed nebula, you get to take 1 mineral. You can also take this mineral even if you don't have the research station, but you have to have an extractor. If you don't have an extractor and you don't have a research station, for example, you only have the single emissary, you don't get to gain minerals. But let's say you do have the research station, and like I just showed you, you can take 1 mineral. Now when instead of a research station, you have a space station on this nebula, you get to gain 2 minerals from that nebula. Now this is important, you cannot gain more than 2 minerals per single turn. Now the limit of 2 minerals per turn only involves gaining them through space and research stations. Because there is another way of gaining minerals, and that's using your rogue class ships. If your rogue class ship is on a tile that is also part of this closed nebula, then that rogue class ship can also gain 1 mineral from that nebula. So look at the situation you have right here. You have 2 rogue class ships, you have 1 space station, and you have 4 minerals on that closed nebula. And you can take all 4 of them, because this space station can gain 2 of them for you. Now this ship can gain 1, and this ship can also gain 1. Because it's 1 mineral per ship. So altogether, you gained 4 minerals. Now the third and final thing that can happen during phase 1 is the evolution of your race, which means you get to gain skills. Now like I said, those 3 tokens are double-sided. On one side you see the universal skills, which are the same for every race, but on the other side you have the specific to your race skills that you can also buy. Now the way it works, if you want to gain a universal skill, you pay 5 credits to the bank. Then you get to pick which skill you want to buy, and you simply add it to your race board like this. Now the thing is, once you attach a skill, you cannot later on during the game flip it to the other side because you all of a sudden decided that you want your specific skill, not the universal skill. If you decide to buy a universal skill, you're stuck with it for the rest of the game. If you however choose to buy a skill that is specific for your race, you use the right side of the token, you attach it to your board, but you pay 10 credits instead of 5 for this skill. So the racial skills are much more pricier basically than the universal skills. Now I'm not going to go over the skills and tell you what they mean because there's quite a lot of them, to be honest, but in this rulebook, the way my rulebook looks right now, which is a prototype version of the rulebook, they're very well explained, and I'm sure once you understand how the game works, you will not have any problems with understanding how the skills work. Okay, so that was phase 1. Now we're moving on to phase 2, which, as I said, is mandatory. You have to resolve phase 2. Phase 2 is expansion. What happens during that phase is you take one of the tiles from the rack. It can be from either of the stacks. You take the tile and then you see what's on the other side. You don't have to show it to other players. You can keep it to yourself, because then you decide which side up you choose to place the tile on the table. So this is now what we're going to talk about. Now this will also be a good time to see what exactly can we find on those tiles. What types of tiles are in this rack and what it means to close something. Because once you place a tile, it can lead to closing of various areas. Let's say you can close a space area, you can close a nebula, you can close a planetary system. This will be a good time to talk about those. So let's see what can happen, or what will happen when you play it during phase 2 expansion. Now before we get to the particulars of taking the space tiles and placing them on the table, let's take a look at the type of space tiles you can find in this game. First of all, I want you to understand what is an outer space. An outer space is any black area on any tile that is basically not the planet or the nebula or anything else. So when you want to place a ship on outer space, you can place it on any tile that has some outer space on it. For example, this tile does. But this one doesn't. This one is all nebula. These are planets, obviously. Now what you see here, those things are so-called starlight paths. Now those starlight paths connect different planets, often creating systems. This green thing is a so-called gas cloud. Gas clouds can be pretty obnoxious because, for example, a ship cannot fly through a gas cloud. Now those red things are so-called nebulas. Now, the way nebulas work is you can also not fly a ship through them. They also happen to close space areas, which you will see in a few moments. And often they contain those extractors. Now, those extractors are useful when it comes to counting up the scores and seeing how much credit you get for example, closing a nebula. But we'll get to that in a few moments. As you can see, there can be plenty elements on a single tile. Like, for example, this tile has the outer space, has the nebula, and the extractor. This tile, for example, has the planet, the starlight path, and a nebula. And finally, you have the 3 tiles that you were asked to make sure are face down when setting up the game. You have the Exmitter, which is a good way to interrupt your opponent's movements. You have the Teleport, which allows you to move more effectively through the galaxy. And then you have the Trading Outpost, the Trade Outpost, which, as you already saw, lowers the price of minerals during the phase 1 of the game. Now the way phase 2 works is pretty straightforward. You take one tile from either of the stacks and then you take a look at what's on the other side. Now you don't have to tell your opponents what is on the other side. But once you choose, you obviously will let them know, because now you get to choose which side up you want to place this tile on the table. Now when this is the first tile placed, it's pretty simple, right? You simply place the tile on the table. But when you place another tile and other tiles, you have to make sure that certain rules are respected. First of all, the tiles have to touch each other's sides, like so. So you cannot place it, and you cannot create something like this. You have to make sure they're adjacent. Second of all, what you see on those tiles has to make logical sense. For example, this one doesn't make sense. And why? Because this starlight path right here leads to nowhere, so you cannot place this tile over here. But if you had this side up, you can place this tile here, because now those starlight paths connect, and those two planets are connected through this starlight path. So basically you have to make sure that there is a matching feature of the galaxy on the tile you're placing. For example, like so. Now when placing those tiles, you can close certain things. For example, you can close a nebula. If I place this tile right here, then as you can see, I just closed this nebula. Because I cannot place any other tiles with a nebula on them to add to this picture, because this is a closed thing. For example, if I take a different tile with a nebula, I cannot place it here because it doesn't make any sense. I cannot place it here because it also doesn't make sense. There is nothing here. There's no nebula here, plus there is the starlight path. So as you can see, this is a fully closed area. Fully closed nebula, to be particular. Placing tiles like so can mean that I just closed a space area, but with those gas clouds. You can see this is a small space area, but it is still a closed one because of those gas clouds right here. You can also close a pretty big area. For example, if I place this tile right here, I just close this whole area with those gas clouds around it. Another thing that can be closed are planetary systems. Now this happens where there are no starlight paths leading out of the system. Because as you can see, there are no starlight paths leading to any of those planets. They are all a closed system. Now, sometimes a system will be consisting of 2 planets, but in this case I managed to close a system with 4 planets. Now you will see what you gain by closing nebulas, space areas and planetary systems later on during the tutorial. So once you've completed the second phase, expansion, and you've placed a tile on the table, now we move on to the third phase, which I remind you is optional. You don't have to resolve this phase. Now, during this phase, this third phase exploration, you perform one action, and only one action. You have 5 actions to choose from. Those actions are research, construction, expedition, teleportation, and moving your ship. Now, one thing you have to know is there are various events that can happen during the game, that can occur during the game. Those events can be the results of, for example, placing a tile on a table, or placing your units somewhere on the board, or on one of the tiles. So those are those events that can happen, and the thing here is that you can choose to first play through the third phase of your turn before you resolve any of those events. But so, for the sake of continuity, let's first take a look at all those 5 phase 3 actions and how you play them. And after I've explained to you how those actions work, then we'll move on to explaining how to resolve those events. So let's see those actions of phase 3. Now the first possible action to take is research, which is very simple because you simply draw 1 mineral at random from the bag. So the second possible action is expedition. You can send your emissaries and your ships on expeditions, which means placing them on the board or on the tiles. But what is important is that you can only place them on the tile that you've put out during the just completed second phase. So let's start with emissaries. The way you do that is you can place them either on a planet, part of a nebula, or on a trade outpost. It doesn't cost anything. You simply take the emissary from your board and you place them where you choose. There are certain benefits to placing your emissary on a trade outpost. First of all, the discounts that you can use during the phase 1 of future turns. Secondly, on the turn that you place your emissary on a trade outpost, you get to do 2 extra actions, but only on the turn when you placed that emissary here. When it comes to ships, you can basically place it on any outer space area, but make sure that it is at least 1 tile away from any enemy ship. Also bear in mind that at any point during the game, you cannot have more than 1 emissary and 1 ship on any tile present in the game. Now we come to the construction action. First of all, you have to have emissaries that are unblocked. So for example, this emissary can perform the construction action and this one cannot because he is blocked by this corvette. But for the sake of this tutorial, let's say that both of them are unblocked. There are 2 things you can construct: research stations and space stations. Let's begin with a research station. You construct research stations by simply taking them from your board and placing them underneath your chosen emissary. You do it like so. Let's say during the course of 2 turns we constructed 2 research stations, one on the nebula and one on the planet. You construct the space station by placing it, as you probably imagined by now, underneath a research station. So let's say we chose to construct this space station right here underneath that research station. Important thing to remember here is that on any planet you can only have 1 space or research station, but on Nebula you can have multiple research and space stations. When you construct, you gain credits. Now you use this formula to determine how many credits. With planetary systems, you take the number of tiles included in the planetary system, you add to it the number of emissaries, and you multiply the result by 4. So here we would get 3 plus 1, that's 4, times 4, that is 16 credits for constructing that research station. The formula works for both the research and the space stations. The formula differs a bit with nebulas. With nebulas you do the same thing, but you multiply the result by 1. So here you would get 4. Because 3 tiles plus 1 emissary times 1, that's 4, which means you would get 4 credits. Only with nebulas, minerals appear as well. 2 minerals appear when you construct a research station, and 4 minerals appear when you construct a space station. So here we have a space station, which means that we draw 4 minerals from the bag and we put it on the nebula. So nebulas give you less credits, but they give you the chance to gain minerals on your future turns. Remember, this is very important. All those stations, research stations, space stations, those stations still count as emissary when it comes to calculating for various purposes, for bonuses and such. A third possible action to take is teleportation. When you place a tile with a teleport, you look at its radius of action. The radius of action is every tile adjacent to the tile with the teleport. Once you do that, you can use your phase-free action to move 1 unblocked emissary or 1 ship from that radius of action to any area of the galaxy. The funny thing is, you can also move your opponent's figures. You don't have to move only your figures. You don't only have to move your emissaries or your ships, you can move that enemy emissary out of that area, which can come in handy. 2 additional things I want you to remember. You can use your phase-free action to put your ship on a tile with a teleport on 1 turn, and then on the next turn, use your phase-free action to use that teleport to get that ship out of here. Another thing I want you to remember is that you can also teleport your emissary to a trade post to gain the extra 2 actions I've mentioned before, or the bonus of discounts I've mentioned before. There are, however, certain exceptions when it comes to where you can teleport your units to. With emissaries, you cannot teleport them to any tile with an Exmitter or any tiles within that Exmitter's radius of action. The radius of action of an Exmitter is exactly the same as it is with a teleport, which is every adjacent tile. You also have to stay away from tiles with other teleports or closed planetary systems controlled by your opponents or closed nebulas controlled by your opponents. And also, you cannot teleport to a tile that is occupied by an enemy emissary. So remember, if you choose to teleport to a nebula that is not controlled by another opponent, you immediately take control over it. You also cannot teleport your emissary to a tile with a Trian extractor. Now you can also teleport your ship. Now it works pretty much the same way. There are also a few exceptions. You also cannot move to a tile with an Exmitter or a tile within that Exmitter's radius of action. You also cannot move that ship to a nebula or to a tile occupied by another ship. If a ship is moved to a tile adjacent to an enemy ship, for example, this green player has his ship right here and the yellow one teleports himself here, this teleportation results in a battle. What happens during the battle, you will see in just a moment. The fifth and final possible action to take is moving your ship. You take one of your ships and you move it up to 3 tiles through the same outer space area. Now you can't move your ships through Exmitters, those Exmitters' radiuses of action, through nebulas or through gas clouds. As was the case with teleportation, if you finish your move on a tile that is adjacent to a tile that has an enemy ship on it, a battle commences. So now you know how to resolve the third, again, optional phase. Now, let's go back to those events. Like I said, various things you do during phase 2 and phase 3, right? Putting tiles on the table and closing, for example, something, or placing your emissaries somewhere on any of the tiles, that can trigger various events. There are 3 types of events in this game. One event is closing. Like I said, I've mentioned this closing before. You can close areas of space, you can close planetary system, you can close nebulas. The second type of event that can occur is battle. Now, obviously you can battle between ships or battle between emissaries. You can't really battle, you can't have a battle between an emissary and a ship. So that's that. The third type of event that can occur is taking control of an area, of a nebula, of a planetary system. Those things can be taken control of. So let's see what happens and how you resolve those particular events. And also this will be a good time to talk about this particular tile, one of those 3 tiles that you were supposed to put face down during the setup of the game, the Exmitter. This will be like the right time to talk and explain to you how that tile works. Also, one thing you have to know, that taking control over something or closing an area during this game will award you certain bonuses like credits or minerals or, I don't know, combat tiles. Now, there are calculations involved. There are quite a few formulas in this game that you have to, well, calculate in order to know how many credits, for example, you get. I will obviously show you those formulas, but don't worry if they seem a bit heady, if there seems to be a bit much to remember just from me telling you about them. There will be a cheat sheet included in the box for you to learn, to just, you know, take a look at and learn, okay, this is how I have to do that in order to know how many credits I get and keep for myself. So don't worry about it. Those formulas may seem complicated, but you will have a cheat sheet in order to help you remember. So let's see how to resolve those events. So the first event we're taking a look at is closing areas. First, let's see how to close nebulas. This is what a closed nebula looks like. A nebula is considered closed when there is no other way for you to add a tile to it to make this particular nebula bigger. As you can see, this is clearly a closed nebula because I simply have no other room of placing tiles with nebulas on them to make those nebulas bigger. Now some nebulas are simply nebulas, but some nebulas have extractors in them. When you close a nebula, you get credits. Now those credits go to the player controlling the nebula. So for example, if you're a green player and you have a yellow player right here and you add a tile closing this nebula, then the credits go to the player controlling it. If there is no one on the nebula, so if it's not controlled by anybody, the credits go to the player who closed that nebula. Now, how many credits do you get? There's a formula for that. The formula goes like this. You take the number of tiles, you add to it the number of emissaries on that nebula, and you multiply that by 1. Now, each extractor within that nebula increases that multiplier by 1. So in this case, we see there are no emissaries on this one, so we have 3 tiles times 2. Because 1 extractor, so it's 1 plus 1, that's 2. 3 tiles, 3 times 2 is 6. That player, whichever player closed that nebula, gets 6 credits. Here we have 3 tiles and 1 emissary, but no extractors. So the multiplier stays at 1, which means we have 3 plus 1, that's 4 times 1. That's 4 credits that would go to the player who closed that nebula. So that's 4 credits that would go to the yellow player because he is controlling that nebula. You will see how to take control of something in just a second. Now when you close a nebula, you don't only get credits, you also get minerals. Well, to be specific, minerals appear on that nebula. Now how many minerals? There's also a formula for that. You simply add the number of tiles, emissaries and extractors within that nebula, and the result you get is the number of minerals you draw randomly from the bag and put on the nebula. So as you can see, in both cases we would put 4 minerals, because here we have 3 tiles, no emissaries but 1 extractor, so that gives us a sum of 4 minerals. Here we have no extractors but 1 emissary, so 3 plus 1 is also 4. That means 4 minerals for this nebula as well. Now when you close planetary systems, now you see this is a closed planetary system because, like I've mentioned before, there are no starlight paths leading away from it. When you close a planetary system, you also get credits. You don't place any minerals on the planetary systems you close. And it works the same way. The player who controls the system gets the credit. If nobody controls the system, the player who closed it gets the credits. Now how do you calculate it here? Here you take the number of tiles plus the number of emissaries and you multiply that result by 2. So we have 4 tiles, 1 emissary, that's 5 times 2 equals 10. That player would get 10 credits. Now I've shown you what it looks like when you close a nebula or when you close a planetary system, but you can also close outer space, or basically space areas. You can close it using gas clouds or nebulas. As you can see, it's pretty obvious what a closed space area looks like, right? You also get credits for it. Now this is very simple. You simply multiply the number of tiles by 3. So in both cases we have 2 tiles multiplied by 3. The player who closed those gets 6 credits. Now another type of event that can happen, that can occur, is battle. Now the first battle we'll take a look at is battle between ships. Battle between ships occur when there are 2 enemy ships on adjacent tiles on a single outer space area, which means they're not blocked off by a gas cloud or by a nebula or by an Exmitter or by anything else. For example, in this situation, those 2 players will fight. So the first thing they do in a battle is they declare combat tokens. Now each player can declare up to 3 combat tokens to use in this battle. For example, let's say those 2 players decided to both declare 2 combat tokens. Now what's important is that you may not have to use your combat tokens, but that doesn't matter. Once you've declared them, you still have to discard them, which means placing them back in the bag. So after you've declared your combat tokens, each player rolls their respective dice. Now, the dice will look different in the final game, but this is what they look like now in this prototype version, well, this almost final prototype version. So as you can see, you compare the results. Now we have 5 here and 4 here. Now they can flip the combat tokens. So for example, this player adds +1 and +1 to their roll. So 2 more points for this player. This player also chose a +1, but he also chose a reroll. These are the only types of combat tokens you get, a +1 or a reroll. So this player looks at the situation and sees, okay, so if I have +1 and 5, that's 6, so that means that there will be a tie because this one has 4 + 2. So do I want to reroll? Yeah, let's reroll. I'm gonna use both my combat tokens. He chooses to reroll, and nothing happens. If, however, this player got really lucky and rolled a 6, he would win this battle because he would compare the final score, which is 7, and here we have 6, so the yellow player would win. That would mean that the green player would take the ship and that ship would return to that player's board. The winner not only gets to be called a winner, but also gets to draw 2 minerals from the bag. However, if there is a tie, which means we would, for example, keep the original roll of 5, and now we would have 6 with 6, then unfortunately both players would lose their ships, which means they would return to those players' respective boards. And nobody gets any minerals, obviously. Now the second type of battle is obviously battle between emissaries. Now emissaries battle when they are together on a closed planetary system or on a closed nebula. So now here we have 2 enemy emissaries, but what can happen is, for example, you can have a much bigger planetary system or you can have a big nebula, and for example you can have multiple emissaries from a single player. And those emissaries give you a bonus for the battle. Each emissary is worth 1 point. So if you had 3 emissaries and the opponent had 1 emissary, then the opponent would be at a serious disadvantage, because that bonus remains until the end of the fight. So even if the yellow player, for example, if he had 3 emissaries and he kept on losing, so he kept on losing emissaries and those emissaries would be going back to his board, he would still, for every single clash, he would always have this +3 bonus. Apart from the bonus, the battle is resolved pretty much the same way as it was with the battle between ships. So each player declares 2 combat tokens face down for now. Each player then rolls the dice. This one rolled 3 and this one rolled 5. Then they flip those combat tokens and they see what's what. So now we have 7, no, not 7 here, 5, 2 plus 1, that is 8. And here we have 1, 4, 5. So 8 to 5. This player definitely decides to re-roll the die. And he rolled a 5, which means nothing, he is still losing. Because now we have 7 to 8, the green player is the winner. Now the battle can be between multiple opponents. Now if there were, for example, if you have 4 players, right, you can have 4 players engaging in a single battle between emissaries. Now the player who wins this clash gets to stay, while all the other players have to take 1 emissary back to their board. If they took their last and only, for example, emissary, then they no longer take part in the battle. Now if both emissaries, if there was a tie, for example, then both emissaries would return to their respective player boards. However, since here we have a clear winner, this emissary gets to go home to his player's board, and this player is a winner, which means he gets to stay and he gets to take control of that planetary system. Again, this battle goes on until there is only 1 emissary left or until there is nobody left. If there is 1 emissary left, like I just said, he takes control of the planetary system. Remember that you get to keep the bonus that you got from your emissaries at the beginning of the battle throughout the whole battle. Okay, so now that you know what the basic mechanics of the battle is, now let's see what a fight would look like between 2 races when there are 2 emissaries on each side. First of all, take a look at this beautiful big nebula that I built especially for you. It's pretty, right? Now listen, when you have placed the tile, when you close the nebula and there is more than one race on the nebula, you do battle the same way. So remember what I said, you calculate a bonus you get for the whole duration of the battle, and that bonus is the number of emissaries. So now both the green and the yellow player would get a +2 bonus for the battle. So that's the first thing. And then the battle goes on as normal. So let's say that exactly the same way as it was a second ago, both players decided to declare 2 combat tokens. Then they both roll their respective dice. And we have a tie with the dice, so that's nice. So let's see the situation that we have right now. The green player has 5 plus 2, that's 7. The yellow player has 5 plus 2, that's also 7. Now let's take a look at the combat tokens that they chose. So now we see that the green player actually has 8, because 5 plus 2 plus 1, that's 8. Now this player for now still stays at 7, because 5 plus 2, that's still 7. So let's say this player, he decided to choose one of this combat token, he decided to use it, and he decides to go for a reroll. Doesn't work. So he goes for the second reroll. Wow, it's even worse. So for this turn, let's say that the green player won, right? Because he has a clear advantage. I mean, he has 5 plus 2 plus 1, that's 8 to 3. So he doesn't even have to use this combat token. He won this clash. Because in such an instance, a battle is constructed of a series of small turns, let's call them clashes. So he won this clash, which means that this player has to get rid of 1 emissary. So this emissary, for example, goes back to the yellow player's board. And now we have a second clash. Those combat tokens go back in the bag. Now, both players get to declare combat tokens one more time, because you declare combat tokens before each clash. If there were more emissaries, if each player had 4 emissaries participating in the battle, there would be multiple clashes. So let's say that once again they both decided, or no, you know what? Let's decide that the green player decided to use 1 combat token and the yellow player decided to use 2 combat tokens. So, like I said, the bonus that was calculated at the beginning of the battle is still the same, regardless of the fact that the yellow player now has only 1 emissary participating in the battle. Both players still have the +2 bonus that they got for their emissaries at the beginning of the battle. So, they declare their combat tokens and they roll the dice. 2, that's a weak roll. 3. Not much better, my friend. So now they both reveal their combat tokens. And now let's take a look at the result. So both of them have the +2 bonus, which means the yellow player has 2 plus 3, that's 5, plus 2, that's 7. Now the green player has 2 plus 2, that's 4, so that's 7 to 4. The yellow player is clearly winning this clash. So let's say the green player decided to use his combat token and re-roll. And it's even worse for him. So now the yellow player won the clash. Green player has to take 1 figure and return it to his or her board. So the battle is not over because we still have 2 competing emissaries present on the nebula. So we're getting ready for yet another clash. Those combat tokens go back in the bag. And because it's another clash, they get to declare more combat tokens. So let's say that the green player chose his final combat token, and let's say the yellow player does the same. He also has only 1 combat token left. They're going all in for this big battle. It's a big nebula, so I don't blame them. So they both roll their dice again. Now he has 4, that's much better. But he has 5. So let's see the result. Bonus stays the same, so it's 2 plus 4, that's 6, 2 plus 5, that's 7. 7 to 6 for now. Let's see the combat tokens. And we have a tie. That's 7 plus 7 because of that combat token. So the yellow player decides to take the risk and he uses his reroll. And unfortunately he lost. Which means that the winning player is the green player and the yellow player has to take his final emissary and return it to the board. Those combat tokens go back in the bag, same as the other ones. And now the green player won because he is the last man standing. So he takes control of that nebula. We will get to taking control and the specifics of that in literally just a second. If, for example, the yellow player chose not to use his combat token and they would stay with the tie because he would have 4 plus 1, that's 5, plus 2, that's 7, 5 plus 2, that's 7, we would have a tie. Both of the emissaries would go back to their player's board. So nobody would be left to take control of that nebula. But if the green player won, he's taking control. And now the final event that can happen is taking control. If at any point during the game you find yourself having the only emissary or a research station or a space station on a closed planet system or a closed nebula, you take control of that planetary system or that nebula. So like here, this one is the only emissary on this closed planetary system, which means that the green player is in control of that planetary system. Now there are many ways to gain control. For example, like we just saw a minute ago, there was a battle and he won the battle and now he's this single emissary on that closed planetary system, which means he got control of it. As a reward for taking control, you get to draw a random combat token from the bag. Now that works the same way whether you control a planetary system or whether you control a nebula. Now bear in mind, like I said, there are many ways. Battle is not the only way to get control of a planetary system or a nebula. Because for example, you might have had this situation and then you decided to place this tile here, closing this planetary system and therefore gaining control. Now same thing here. For example, you had a situation like this, you had two tiles and during the second phase you took a tile like this and you placed it right here, closing that nebula. That means you took control of that nebula because your emissary is the only emissary here, it's the only figure in this nebula, which means you take control of it and you draw one random combat token. One thing I need you to know, that nebula was just closed. Now there are only green players' emissaries on the nebula. And right after the closing of a nebula, if there are only single player's emissaries present there, he can choose to remove a certain amount of them and take them back to their board. But he can only do it if he is the one who closed that nebula. So let's say this is the case. The green player just put in, for example, this tile and he closed this nebula. And he thinks, well, I don't need 3 emissaries in this nebula. I can take one of them back to the board. I'm fine with 2 of them for building the space stations and the research stations. So I'm just going to take this one back to the board. I'm going to leave those 2 behind. Remember, if you want to get any sort of bonuses for taking control of the nebula and such, you have to keep at least 1 emissary there. But the situation is slightly different when the nebula is closed by a player whose emissaries are not present there. For example, if it was the yellow player's turn and he puts that tile in right here, closing that nebula, and the green player has his emissaries right here, right where you can see them right now, the green player is not able to remove any of those emissaries. So if he was building up, for example, the green player was building up the number of emissaries on the nebula in order to close it on some future turn and get plenty of great bonuses for it, well, he still gets those bonuses. But he will not be able to take any of his emissaries back to his board. Because he might have been thinking, well, okay, I'm going to keep those emissaries here. And then after I close the nebula and get the bonuses, you know what, I'm going to take 2 of them back to my board. Well, now that the yellow player closed the nebula, not the green player is stuck here with those 3 emissaries because, as you can remember, there are limitations to when and how you can move your emissaries across the galaxy. Well, technically this is not an event. It also doesn't count as one of your phase 3 actions, and I wanted to mention it here, tell you how the Exmitter works. Now, whenever a tile with an Exmitter is placed, any ship or any emissary within its radius of action, and let me remind you, the radius of action is any adjacent tile, every ship and every emissary is returned to their players' boards. Now this only works on emissaries and ships. It does not work on space stations or research stations. Now remember, no units, emissaries or ships can be placed or transported to this tile or any tile within its radius of action. And that's basically it. That's how the gameplay looks. When it's your turn, you go through 3 phases. You have the first phase, which is optional, you don't have to resolve it. Then you have the second phase, which you have to resolve. Then you have the third phase, which you also don't have to resolve. After you've done that, the turn moves on to another player, and he does the exact same thing. Resolves only 2 phases, or 1 phase, or all 3 phases. And that's how it goes around the table until the game is finished. The game is over after the turn during which the final tile from that rack was drawn. Then the game ends. Then what you do is you count up the score. The credits you've collected during the game are your victory points. Whoever has the most credits wins the game. How you do that is first you take the minerals that you've collected during the game and you exchange them into credits. Each mineral, whatever the type, whatever the color, each mineral is worth 3 credits. After every single player in clockwise order did that, now everyone, also in clockwise order, has the chance to do some plundering, which is like your final action, the final thing you do during this game, and that allows you to get some extra credits. Now you can engage in plundering when you have a corvette, a single corvette or more corvettes, like in this case I decided to put 2 corvettes for this example, on a tile that is within a closed planetary system controlled by your opponent. But that system cannot be simply controlled, which means if he only has an emissary on that system, you cannot plunder. He has to have at least a research station or a space station. So the way it works is now you get a chance to get some extra credits. And the funny thing here is you resolve for each of the corvettes. Here's how you calculate the number of credits you get for plundering. You take the number of your corvettes and you multiply it by the number of tiles within that planetary system. This is how you do it for a research station. So you take the number of tiles 4 times 2 corvettes, that's 8. So that player would get 8 credits. If, however, the green player had a space station here instead of a research station, you would get even more credits, because now the multiplying would look like this. Number of tiles times number of corvettes times 2. So we have 4 tiles times 2 corvettes times 2. That gives us 16 credits. And here's an interesting aspect. You don't take those credits from the bank. You take those credits from the player who controls that planetary system. They have to give you their personal credits. Remember, like I said, you cannot plunder a planetary system if there is only an emissary there, or you cannot plunder a system that is controlled by no one. Whew. We did it! This is the end. That's it. Whoever has the most credits wins the game. Listen, I've went through everything you need to know to play the game Galaxy of Tryan. I know this is probably quite a lengthy video, so there is an index in the description so you can easily get to whatever part interests you the most at any given moment. Now, like I said, there is a Kickstarter campaign. The link to the Kickstarter campaign is in the description below. If any of what you saw in here looks like something you might enjoy, get a kick out of the game, then this is probably something you should check out. Now, like I said, I told you everything you need to know to play Galaxy of Tryan. Now, the things you need to know, though this is the full version. There is a simpler variant that you might want to choose for your first couple of games. Now, I made a conscious decision to first go through the full version and to now give you the very simple rules of making the game even easier. Now, the way you play the simpler variant is you simply get rid of the skills and you get rid of all the ships. You simply ignore any rules involving those two things, ships and skills. So without them you get to play and you get to just, it's going to be a much simpler, much faster game, and it will be a good way to get yourself with the flow, and then you can try the full version of it. So that's how you play the simpler variant. Listen, if you have any questions regarding the mechanism of the game, do not hesitate to ask the question in the comments below. I'll get to you as soon as possible. And please be aware that this is very close to the final version of what the game will look like. But there are going to be a few changes. Obviously the rulebook is not going to look the way it looks now, the way I showed you. The box is going to be a much bigger box. I've heard rumblings that it's going to be even bigger than the box for Twilight Imperium 3rd edition. So the dice will look different, right? They are not going to be your standard dice. So a few things might change here and there, but basically this is what it's going to look like. This is going to be the general feel you'll get from the game. So I think that's it. If you have any questions, please ask me and I'll answer them as soon as I can. I hope this video, even if it was a bit lengthy, managed to somehow answer some of your questions with regards to is this game something that I might be interested in. I hope this gave you a good feel of what the game flow is like. And as always, thank you for watching, and I hope I see you soon. I hope to do more of those English language video tutorials in the future, so if you want to be up to date, please do subscribe, and thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!